All right, so today we are going to set our bezel, or we're going to create our bezel wire for our cabochon stone. So once your sketches are done, then we are all going to have a rolled out piece of bezel wire that you can use, and it can be either copper, silver, or gold. So it's up to you, and it's going to have to work with your designs. So depending on how your design is laid out is going to depend on the bezel color that you will be using. So the first step in creating your bezel wire starts a little bit like our ring band, but we are going to use tape instead of paper. So you're going to take yourself a piece of masking tape, and then you're just going to cut your masking tape into a thin little strip. Might take a little finesse to cut your masking tape. It doesn't need to be perfect, just want to make it a little bit thinner than the thick 1-inch. Once you have your strip of masking tape, you're going to cut the 1-inch blunt, so it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to wrap the tape around my stone. It should be flush with the bottom of your stone as you go all the way around. Okay, so now my masking tape has crossed over. So I need to put some marks on here. I'm going to put a mark to where my masking tape overlaps, and then I'm going to move just about 1/8 of an inch over to account for the thickness of the metal. So this can be our bezel size. So everybody sees this size? Just that little smudging over. It's not too much, okay? So once that's done, just unwrap your tape, and then you're going to take your bezel wire. You're going to make sure that the end of your bezel wire is cut flush and flat, and you can just do this with a pair of scissors. Lay your bezel wire down, lay your tape next to or on top, and then you are going to cut the second line, and it should be nice and flat. So here's my bezel wire here, and this is what I'm going to be using on my stone. Now, if you're using silver or another type of wire that's not very flexible, you may need to anneal this to make it a little bit more flexible, because right now we're going to do a little tester. I'm going to take the wire, and I'm going to wrap it around my stone as tightly as I can to make sure it's going to fit. So I'm not going to be able to do it perfectly, but I just want to make sure that the two ends are going to touch. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty set right there. So now I'm going to work just like we worked with our ring band. We're going to take the two ends first. I'm going to flatten them out, and I'm going to bring them around and bring them closer together. I need to make sure that these are filed flat, because if they're not, then they're not going to get a successful butt solder, and you might have some gaps. So you need to just take a little file and file the two ends of your bezel wire nice and flat. So now I need to force these two ends together. So if you remember how we did before, where we weave our wire in and out of itself and then wiggle it left and right, it's going to help to line it up, and it's going to force the wire together. This is going to be much more challenging than your ring band, due to the fact that this is a lot thinner and it tends to pop off relatively easy. So you got to be careful with it. So now that that is all butted together, I'm going to go ahead and solder my piece. Just going to balance it inside some honeycombs. Paint a little bit of flux right on the seam. And we'll be using hard solder. This is our first solder joint in a series of joints throughout this project. So you want to use hard first, because you do not want your seam to break as you're moving on through the project. So this is a thin wire, so I do not need a lot of solder, just a little chip right on top of the seam. I can get a hold of one here. And there we go. So I'm just gonna lay that chip right over top. Now I'm ready to get started soldering. So goggles on, hair back, of course. And you're gonna start your torch, and it should be about a medium flame. Not too hot, because if it's too hot, it's gonna melt your bezel wire, and that's gonna be your challenge. So you do not wanna melt your bezel wire as you're trying to melt your solder, or else you have to start all over again. So I'm gonna heat slowly around my wire first. And you're gonna see some patinas start to hit. So your wire's gonna start to turn dark. Your flux is gonna turn white. Once your flux turns white, you may move your torch closer. Once it turns clear, you may move your torch even closer, and then your solder should flow right in between that seam. Which you just did. Turn off your torch. Quench your bezel wire. Now, in a perfect world, if this wasn't a demonstration, I would make you immediately go to the pickle and pickle for 10 minutes. Thank you so much. So now I'm ready to do a tester. So notice now my bezel wire is much more annealed, so I can actually manipulate it a lot easier, but my solder joint is straight across, so it's nice and secure, and there are no gaps, so I'm in good shape here. So I'm just going to kind of manipulate my wire first. I'm going to manipulate it into an oval because that's the shape of my stone. And unfortunately, I have to work on a bit of a warm surface here, so I'm just going to put this back. I'm going to place the stone down. It kind of blends into the block, actually. And I'm going to press my wire down and around the stone. So as I press that down and around, it should fit on relatively snug, so you shouldn't see any air gaps in between, but you should be able to pop it in and out of your bezel wire. If it's too small, we can stretch it a bit on a ring mandrel. So if it's just a little bit snug, we can stretch it on a mandrel. If it's too big, you're gonna have to snip the solder joint and make it a little smaller and then resolder it, okay? Sounds good? Great. So we're not done yet. At this point, now I need to measure the height of the bezel wire. So does anyone have a lead pencil by chance? Because I had one over here, now it's missing. Perfect. Thank you, Hope. So the height of your bezel wire is going to be really important because it needs to go up the shoulder of the cabochon. If it's too high, when you try to bend your bezel wire over, you're gonna get crimping. If it's too low, it's not gonna hold your stone in place. So it should be right at the edge of the shoulder. And sometimes that's difficult to figure out, but an easy way to do this is if you take a lead pencil, I don't know why lead works so much better, and you rest it on the tip or the highest point of your cabochon and angle it down and draw a line with the pencil. It's gonna make a pencil mark, which you're then gonna wanna go over with a Sharpie marker. Okay, so that's going to create a mark on the inside edge. So that's the height that my bezel wire should be, which means I now need to sand this down to that height because I need to make sure that it's going to fit properly, because if it's too big, it's going to look not so great because it'll be nice and crimped up. So now sanding comes into place. You know your bezel wire fits, you're in good shape. You're just going to move this off to the side. You're going to get yourself a piece of tape and a fresh piece of 220 sandpaper. You're going to tape the sandpaper down to your table, and you're going to go in a rounded motion, and you are going to sand both sides of your bezel wire. It needs to be perfectly flat because you're going to be soldering this onto a flat piece of metal, and if there's any air gaps, your solder's not going to flow. You're also going to sand it down to that height that you need it to be. Remember how you did that height check? So you're going to need to make sure that it's sanded down to the proper height. If you're unsure if you have any air gaps, what you can do is you can do a test on it. So you can take a flat piece of metal, lay your bezel wire on it, and drop your head down to its level and rotate it around. If you see any light or air between your metal and your bezel wire, then you know you need to sand a little bit more because this needs to be perfectly flush and flat on both sides. So I have a little bit of an air gap over here, but I still have a good amount of sanding to do. You'll probably do this for an entire class period. Little circles, nice and flat, okay? When that's done and nice and cleaned up, and to the right size, you can go ahead and get a little file and just file some of the solder if it bled out. File that away from your bezel wire. And that is step 1.